The vanishing flight. It was a foggy evening at Los Angeles International Airport as passengers hurried through the terminal, eager to board Flight 162, a long-haul flight bound for Tokyo. The plane, a Boeing 747, gleamed under the dim airport lights as ground crew completed final preparations. Inside the terminal, families said their goodbyes, business travelers checked their watches, and children clutched their favorite toys. Everything seemed perfectly routine. As the passengers boarded the aircraft, they were greeted with warm smiles from the flight attendants. The seats filled up quickly, and soon the pilot, Captain Robert Harrington, announced that they were ready for takeoff. The plane taxied down the runway, and within moments, it was airborne, cutting through the thick fog that blanketed the city. For the first few hours of the flight, everything was calm. The passengers settled in, some watching movies, others dozing off. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, serving meals and drinks. Then, somewhere over the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, something strange happened. The plane encountered a sudden and violent turbulence, shaking violently as it passed through a cloud bank. The lights flickered, and the passengers gripped their armrests in fear. Captain Harrington's voice crackled over the intercom, assuring everyone that it was just a rough patch of weather. But the turbulence grew worse, and soon, the aircraft was shaking so hard that the overhead compartments popped open, spilling luggage into the aisles. Suddenly, the plane went dark. The engines roared loudly, then abruptly quieted, leaving an eerie silence. The plane seemed to hang in the air for an eternity before plummeting downward. Panic erupted in the cabin as oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, and passengers screamed in terror. The flight attendants, struggling to remain calm, urged everyone to put on their masks and brace for impact. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the turbulence stopped. The plane leveled out, and the lights flickered back on. Captain Harrington's voice, now shaken, came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We appear to have encountered an unexpected phenomenon, but everything is under control. We're attempting to re-establish contact with air traffic control." But when the crew tried to reach the ground, they were met with silence. Every frequency they tried yielded no response. The radar screens showed nothing but static, and the navigation systems seemed to be malfunctioning. It was as if the plane had been cut off from the rest of the world. Hours passed, and fear grew among the passengers. The crew continued to try to reach someone, anyone, on the ground, but to no avail. The aircraft was flying blind, with no idea of its location or destination. Then, something even more chilling happened. The stars outside the windows began to shift, twisting and swirling like water down a drain. The passengers watched in horror as the sky itself seemed to be warping, pulling them into some unknown void. Suddenly, the plane's nose pitched downward, and the aircraft plunged into darkness. The last thing anyone heard was the sound of the engines screaming before everything went black. The next morning, air traffic controllers at LAX realized that Flight 162 had vanished without a trace. Rescue operations were launched, but there was no sign of the plane, no wreckage, no debris, nothing. It was as if the plane had never existed. Months passed, and hope of finding the missing plane faded. Then, a fisherman on a remote island in the Pacific made a startling discovery. Washed up on the shore was an airplane seat, with a name tag still attached that read, Flight 162. Inside the seat pocket was a note, scrawled in frantic handwriting, "We're still here, but not where we should be. Help us." The note was dated 3 months after the plane had disappeared. To this day, no one knows what happened to Flight 162, but the seat and note remain locked away in a secure facility, kept from the public eye. The ghost in the terminal. Denver International Airport is an enigma to many, with its vast, labyrinthine underground tunnels, strange artwork, and bizarre conspiracy theories. However, the airport holds a more sinister secret, one that is whispered among the employees who work the graveyard shift. It was on one of these late nights that a janitor named Miguel was going about his usual rounds. The airport was quiet, the bustling crowds of the day long gone, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional echo of footsteps in the empty concourses. As Miguel pushed his cleaning cart through Concourse B, he suddenly heard something that made him stop in his tracks, a faint, sorrowful crying. Miguel stood still, listening intently. The sound was unmistakable, a woman sobbing somewhere in the distance. It was unusual to hear anything other than the mechanical whir of cleaning equipment this late at night, and his heart began to race. He hesitated, but his sense of duty pushed him to investigate. He followed the sound down the long, deserted corridor, his footsteps echoing eerily off the walls. The crying grew louder as he approached gate B27. The gate area was empty, the chairs neatly arranged in rows, the departure screen displaying a flight that had long since departed. But there, sitting alone in one of the chairs, was a woman. She was dressed in an old-fashioned flight attendant's uniform, her face buried in her hands as she wept. Miguel's fear was momentarily replaced by concern. Perhaps she was a lost traveler, or maybe she had received bad news. He approached her cautiously, his voice soft as he asked if she needed help. The woman did not respond. She continued to cry, her shoulders shaking with each sob. Miguel reached out to touch her shoulder, hoping to comfort her, but as soon as his fingers made contact, she lifted her head. What Miguel saw next would haunt him for the rest of his life. The woman's eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck the very light from the room. Her mouth opened wide in a soundless scream, her face contorting into an expression of pure terror. Miguel stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He blinked, and in that split second, the woman vanished into thin air, leaving only the empty chair behind. Miguel's breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to make sense of what he had just witnessed. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor as he fled back to the safety of the main terminal. When he finally reached his supervisor's office, he burst in, his face pale and his body trembling. He recounted the incident, expecting disbelief, but his supervisor merely sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You're not the first to see her," he said quietly. That gate, B27, was where Flight 727 was supposed to depart from back in 1965. The flight never made it. The plane crashed shortly after takeoff, killing everyone on board. They say she was one of the flight attendants, still waiting for her passengers to arrive. Miguel never worked the night shift again, and he avoided Concourse B altogether. But others who have worked those late hours have reported seeing the same woman, always sitting alone at gate B27, waiting for a flight that will never come. The terminal that time forgot. In the summer of 1983, Edward Kramer, a seasoned businessman, found himself on a tight schedule. He was traveling through O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, one of the busiest and most chaotic airports in the world. Edward was used to the hustle and bustle, the frantic pace of air travel, but this trip would be unlike any other. Edward had just arrived from a connecting flight and was in a rush to catch his next flight to New York. With only a short layover, he hurried through the terminal, his briefcase in hand. The signs and gates blurred together as he navigated the crowded concourses, his mind focused on making it to his gate on time. But as he walked, he realized something was wrong. The noise of the airport, a constant background of announcements, conversations, and rolling suitcases, began to fade away. The crowds thinned, and soon, Edward found himself in a part of the airport he didn't recognize. The lights were dimmer, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. Edward looked around, trying to find a sign that would tell him where he was, but the terminal seemed eerily deserted. The polished floors were scuffed, the walls dull, as if they hadn't seen maintenance in years. His unease grew with each step, but he pressed on, convinced he must have taken a wrong turn. Finally, he spotted a gate ahead, Gate 13, with a flight listed for New York. Relieved, he approached the gate agent, a woman dressed in a uniform that seemed strangely outdated, like something from the 1950s. She sat behind the counter, her face pale and expressionless. "Excuse me," Edward said, "I think I'm lost." Can you direct me to the main terminal? The woman looked up slowly, her eyes dull and lifeless. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, her gaze shifted past Edward, as if she were looking at something, or someone, just behind him. Edward turned around, but the corridor behind him was empty. When he turned back to the gate, the agent was gone, the counter abandoned. The departure screen flickered, and for a brief moment, the entire terminal seemed to shudder, the lights dimming further until they almost went out completely. Edward's heart pounded in his chest. He felt as though he was being watched, but by whom or what, he couldn't say. He backed away from the gate, his breath quickening, and turned to leave, but the corridor ahead seemed longer than he remembered. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the air grew colder, making it difficult to breathe. Desperate to escape, Edward ran, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the empty terminal. The further he went, the more distorted his surroundings became. The walls warped and twisted, the lights flickering like dying candles. He could hear faint whispers, like distant voices trapped behind a wall. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Edward burst through a set of double doors and found himself back in the bustling main terminal. The noise of the airport hit him like a wave, announcements blaring, people rushing past, the normal chaos of O'Hare. Gasping for breath, he looked around, disoriented but relieved to be back in familiar surroundings. He hurried to the nearest information desk and frantically described his experience to the staff, but they only looked at him with confusion. "Sir," one of them said, "there is no Gate 13 at O'Hare. That terminal was demolished years ago." Edward stood there in stunned silence, the reality of what he had just experienced sinking in. He never found out what had happened in that forgotten part of the airport, but he avoided O'Hare whenever possible after that day. Some say he had stumbled into a place that shouldn't exist, a terminal caught in a time loop, where lost souls wait eternally for flights that will never depart.